Hi, this is Daniel Ham, and our reading is Introduction to Industry and Company Analysis. This reading provides the tools and framework for assessing companies and industries. Make sure you tie this into equity valuation, and you're very likely to see a lot of these concepts repeated at level 2. So to start with, I'm going to draw up a top-down analysis framework, and it's important to understand this as a background because we can tie a lot of these ideas to a top-down perspective. So give me a chance to kind of draw a graphic up here, and it looks like this. I'm going to start with some circles. It's the first circle. That's supposed to be a circle. 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm going to start with the inner circle. In the inner circle, I'm going to put a big C here for companies. So if you have a bunch of companies that are related, it makes up an industry. Related industries make up the sector. The sectors make up the economy. And as a top-down analyst or top-down portfolio manager, you're going to start with the macroeconomic environment, and then you're going to select favorable sectors, and within those sectors, favorable industries, and within those industries, you're going to go with favorable companies. So top-down, start from the outside, go toward the inside, so the arrow is pointing from outside to the inside. A couple of things to also highlight is in terms of economics. We're going to talk about the business cycle, so recall that from the macroeconomics. And then sectors. And sectors really are an industry classification system, so we'll talk about that specifically. And now we're going to start with looking at 3 specific uses of industry analysis. So the first use is contextual. And we drew up the top-down analysis, and the inner 2 circles are industry and company. So the growth opportunities, the competitive environment, and the risks associated with the industry is going to filter down to the company, and the companies will filter up to the industry. Second use of industry analysis is for active management. What we mean by active management is that relative to, say, passive management, which is indexing, when we index, active managers are now allowed to deviate away from benchmarking. So decisions made by that can impact portfolio returns. So you could categorize industries in 2 basic schemes. One is in terms of outlook. You could look at positive, negative, or neutral outlook. Or you could just categorize industries to favorable or unfavorable relative to, say, the business cycle. So if you're going to weight the portfolio, you're going to overweight the favorable industries and underweight the unfavorable, as opposed to, say, rotation strategy among industries. What we do there is we're going to look at the business cycle, and if you remember from macroeconomics, I'm going to start with the bottom. The bottom is called the trough, and as we head upwards, it's called the expansion part of the expansion phase of the cycle. Then you hit the peak. Then you go down to the contractionary or recessionary part of the curve and back to the trough. So if you have cyclical industries would outperform. Cyclical meaning sensitive to the business cycle. Cyclical industries tend to outperform when the business cycle is expansionary and underperform when the business cycle is contractionary. So you rotate into cyclical industry groups when the business cycle is expanding, and then you rotate into the non-cyclicals or defensive industries when the business cycle tends to head toward contraction. So, or in the contraction phase. The third use of industry analysis is performance attribution. For level 1, you will not have to calculate this, but just understand this idea. Performance attribution is a way for us to figure out what percent can be attributed to the source of portfolio return. So, based on your ability to select industries, what percent is attributable to that decision? So that's performance attribution. Those are the 3 uses of industry analysis. Next, we're going to look at the 3 different approaches to industry groupings. And the first that are listed on this particular slide, we're going to come back to because I'd like to elaborate on some of these points. But the first one is the products and services, the idea of sectors. Second is the business cycle sensitivity, which we sort of talked about already. We'll come back to this as well. If you notice, these are kind of these sectors that are kind of listed within the sensitivity of this business cycle. We'll come back to that specifically. But I'm going to start with a third approach. And the third approach is the statistical groupings. And specifically, when we're talking about statistical approach, is that we're going to look at, let's say that we're going to divide up all firms into 4 buckets. So bucket 1, 2, 3, and 4. So what we're going to do is, because of historical returns, everything that's highly correlated get lumped into the same bucket. So bucket 1 has all the stocks or companies that are similarly highly correlated within the bucket, and between the buckets, they're either non-correlated or they're negatively correlated. So those are the ideas. More importantly, we're going to look at the limitations of the statistical groupings. First, the problem with that is that historically correlations don't persist. In other words, there's no consistency. So a stock that was in the first bucket may jump to different buckets because now they may have something more correlated with other stocks. That's the first problem. Second, they could be non-intuitive. So you could have in the same bucket 2 companies that are unrelated by any stretch of the imagination. So let's say you have a high-tech software company and a trucking company, and they have nothing to do with each other, but they happen to be in the same bucket just because of the returns. Lastly, the third reason and the limitation is we sort of talked about the time period already, so let's talk about specifically the countries. Let's say you have 2 countries, country A and country B, and they happen to be countercyclical. So when country A is doing well economically, country B does not so well, or is in the recessionary phase, and vice versa. Just so happens that 2 different types of stocks within these 2 countries can look similarly because of the countercyclicality of the countries. Now we're coming back to the product services idea. Classification systems, there's 2 categories, the commercial and the government. We'll start with the commercial. And the example that we see on the slide is called the GICS. Stands for Global Industry Classification Standard. And this was developed by Standard & Poor's and BERA. And I'm going to kind of tweak the names because the names have changed somewhat. And basic materials is no longer called basic materials, it's called materials. Consumer discretionary, consumer staple, energy, financial services, and healthcare remain the same. Industrial durables is now called industrials. Technology is now called information technology. Telecommunications is now called telecommunication services. And utilities remain the same as well. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to circle 4 of these sectors: consumer staples, healthcare, telecommunication services, and utilities as being non-cyclical or less cyclical, so defensive. So the other 6 that I did not circle are going to be categorized as cyclical. A couple other things I want to kind of mention. I'm going to give you an example of the 3 or 4 tiers. Let's look at Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola happens to be in the consumer sector, consumer staple sector. It is in the beverage industry group. It is in the soft drink industry. And it is part of if there was a sub-industry, if we want to go down to the 4th tier, you could say it's the carbonated soft drinks. That's the commercial classification. Let's look at the government. Government classification system, and an example here is the North American Industry Classification, 6-digit code, numeric, that determines a company and where it fits in. The good thing about this government classification system that you can compare over time and across industries, especially if you're using the North American Industry Classification. It's used by Canada, US, and Mexico. But there's 2 drawbacks. And the first drawback is that this is less frequently updated than the commercial system. So there may be, if there's any buys and sells of different segments of their companies, It may be no longer related in that classification, and yet it still remain in that group. And they do not distinguish between public and private companies, large or small, or profit or non-profit. So it's difficult to create a peer group if these things are out of date and for this particular purpose. Now we're back to the business cycle sensitivity. I'm going to give you an example, two classifications, cyclical, non-cyclical. Once again, cyclicals are highly sensitive. Non-cyclicals could be less sensitive or non-sensitive. And I'll give you an example of both, and I'll give you an example of all three. Cyclical, one of the sectors of cyclical was financial services. Financial services are very cyclical, and so they're highly dependent on the business cycle, as opposed to a defensive non-cyclical sector, something like basic goods, so things like consumer staples. Beverages is an industry group that tends to be defensive, as opposed to, say, growth. Growth non-cyclical means it's non-sensitive. The business cycle is irrelevant to its growth. For example, iPad it's very specific to a product, but also it's kind of driven some of the Apple's earnings, that and obviously the iPhone. But the iPad came out in 2010, and the iPad came out at a time when the economy was not doing well. But the sales and the demand for this product was so strong, it was irrelevant. The business cycle was irrelevant, and it would have been done just as well, probably, or even better, if the economy was doing well. So that leads us to the peer group. What do we mean by peer group? I'm going to give you ways to look at what a peer group, the definition of a peer group first. Peer groups tend to have similar business activities, the demand drivers, cost structures, and availability of capital. So I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to look at Disney relative to News Corp. So in one group setting, peer groups, because Disney, their primary lines of businesses include broadcast TV, the movie distribution and movie production, as well as theme park operations. News Corp, News Corp is part of Fox, is part of News Corp. Fox does broadcast television, does the movie business as well, but News Corp also owns other publications. It's in the magazine and the newspaper business. But you can put these two, Disney and News Corp, as a peer group, and it will often come out in the annual reports, industry reports, as peers, because primarily their businesses, there are a lot more revenues that come from the similar lines of business than the smaller lines of businesses. And it's very important to understand peer groups, because especially if you're going to value private companies in equity valuation, a lot of times you're not going to have information on private companies. So a lot of times you're going to take the peer group information and use it as a proxy to value private firms. Now we're going to go through some of the elements of industry analysis, and there's a laundry list of 9. It's kind of a process checklist. And what we mean by that, I want to go through them in order. And the top one, it really is a top-down analysis. Evaluate relationship between macroeconomic variables and industry. Next, we're going to estimate industry projections, because after all, if we're going to value something, what do? Project point forward. So we're going to look at different approaches, do some stress testing. Then we're going to do kind of a reality check by looking at your analysis against other analysts. Now, there's no problem if it's different, as long as you can figure out why it's different. And you may have some unique insight that you could justify your analysis being different than the other analysts. Then you're going to compare the industry valuations across time, and kind of give you a contextual framework. Then you're going to analyze the industry prospects using either strategic groups, and strategic groups could be similar businesses, which also makes them peers, or because there's some strategic advantages, they may not be a peer company, but they may share some strategic elements, and so therefore you can use that as a basis for comparison. Then you're going to classify industries within the life cycle stage. We will be doing some extensive work with the life cycle, because it's one of the keys to this reading. And there are 5 stages: the embryonic, growth, shakeout, mature, and decline. I'm not sure I would call it declining, it's more of a decline stage. And so what you're going to do is going to classify and put your industry in one of these 5 categories. It's important to understand why you're doing that, going back to valuation. Then you're going to position your industry on the experience curve. Where are you exactly? Are we toward the beginning of the experience curve where the cost per unit is going to be relatively high, versus toward the further down the experience curve you go, or the length of time has passed, it's more likely your cost per unit is low, your output per unit is high, and that's based on the experience. A couple other things to understand about experience curve is you're looking at the cumulative output, not on a per year basis. You're looking at overall output since the beginning till now. Then you're going to consider some of the external forces. There are 5 of these: demographic, macroeconomic, governmental, social, and technological influences, and we'll give you some examples in another slide. Which leads us to the 9th and one of the most important elements of industry analysis is the forces that determine industry competition. And in order to determine this particular thing, we're going to talk about Porter's 5 forces. This is absolutely vital. This is a very important piece of the reading. You must understand this model in its entirety. We'll talk about all 5, and I'm going to draw you a kind of a graphic to do a basic analysis. Make sure you understand how these 5 forces work within the intensity of industry competition. And in general, the more intensity of that industry competition, the more competitive that industry, the less pricing power, the less profit potential, and the less return on capital. So I'm going to wipe this off a little bit. Give me a second to kind of draw this up and give you a kind of a general idea of how this works. So I'm going to wipe this out, give you a 5 forces model. I'm going to start with the going order. The first thing is the internal industry current. In my little model, I'm just going to have companies A, B, C, D. Things like economies of scale, intensity of rival, cost parameters, cost production, your ability to be efficient and profitable are going to be determined by how intense this rivalry is. So an existing rivalry. One of the key variables is economies of scale. I think I mentioned that already. And then I'm going to start drawing some of the external ones. This is the new entrants. Anytime we talk about threat of new entrants, the biggest thing we're going to talk about is barriers to entry. So new companies are trying to come into this industry. If there's high barriers to entry, it's going to be very difficult to get in, or almost impossible. Obviously, if you're in the industry, you would like to see high barriers to entry. If you're a new entrant, you would love to see potentially low barriers to entry. It's really, but a lot of profit, especially if this industry is very profitable, the threat of new entrants is probably higher. Once again, one of the biggest factors is barriers to entry. Then we're going to look at substitutes. And substitutes, and part of what determines your industry competitiveness is your ability to differentiate your product or any cost-related advantages. But if you are commodity-like, and there's a lot of high threats to substitutes, that's going to make it incredibly difficult to compete. Let's say that you're in the dairy industry, and in a very specific, let's say you're doing, you produce butter, and somebody finds a phenomenal substitute for butter. Now that's changed the dynamics of what's happening. The threat of substitute is large. It makes it much more competitive within your industry. The fourth force here is bargaining power of your suppliers. And so the sales process goes this way. Let's say everybody buys from one supplier. That means the bargaining power of suppliers is exceptionally high, which also means that it's very difficult to create additional profits since everybody's buying from the same supplier, and you're sort of at the whim of your suppliers. And the last force is your buyers. Similar arguments can be made for suppliers and the industry as to the industry to the buyers. Sales process is this way. Let's say that you are a generic apparels industry, and so you have no name brands. It's really very high cost. Is probably one of the biggest ways for you to compete. And let's say all of you sell to the same buyer, a huge retail presence like, say, Walmart. If that's the case, your buyer has a lot of bargaining power, and they're going to dictate a lot of pricing to you, even though they are the buyer. I cannot stress enough how important Porter's Five Force is, so make sure you do a thorough analysis of this particular model. That gets us to the next 4 ideas, which is the barriers to entry, industry competitiveness, industry concentration, industry capacity, and market share stability. So the first of, and we're going to compare all these 4 things specifically to the pricing power, which also leads to profitability as well as return on capital. So barriers to entry, we talked many of the pieces already. So high barriers to entry limit new competitors. If you're in the existing industry, you like to see high barriers, especially if you're very profitable. And one of the ways you can kind of do a quick check to see how easily it is to get into the industry is to look at the industry over time. So let's say over the last 30 years, you had the same 5 firms competing, and let's say that they're somewhat equal in market share. And that kind of tells you how competitive this environment is, which also shows you that the more competitive the environment, the less pricing power, which is the next point. So going back to examining the composition over time, same 5 companies, really in the last 30 years, that tells you the barriers to entry has been relatively high. And if you have, I think I mentioned this already, the undifferentiated product, commodities like, or high barriers to exit. What we mean by high barriers to exit is that a lot of machine-based firms have high fixed costs. Therefore, a lot of times they're going to continue to produce even at beyond capacity just to cover the variable costs and maybe some of the fixed costs, high barriers to exit. As opposed to barrier to entry and competitive environment may change over time. Absolutely. The whole stability with respect to all these 4 things we're going to talk about is very important. If it's unstable or unstable, then it's going to change over time. Next is industry concentration. All else being equal, industry concentration, and look at it from a relative basis, not on an absolute basis. So high concentration, depending upon whether it's absolute or relative, determines pricing power. So if you have, for example, absolute market share, let's say you have 2 companies that is the whole industry. And one kind of way to look at it is if you are a commercial plane manufacturers, Airbus and Boeing, because they're somewhat interchangeable, the buyers look at them as almost one for the other. And so they're somewhat looked upon as commodity-like. And so they don't have, both of these companies have very little pricing power, even though they make up virtually the whole commercial airline, airplane manufacturers. So it's not the absolute market share, it's really the relative. So I'll give you another example. Relative market share, you could have 2 big competitors. Let's say the top company market share is about 10%, the next is 8%, but everybody else, the third competitor and everybody else has, say there's like 30 or 40 of these things, are fragmented. If that's the case, the top 2 companies do have some pricing power, and these fragmented companies are going to be somewhat price takers based on what the top 2 companies do. And the last idea is that low industry concentration, total market fragmentation. In other words, many firms all having a very small percentage of the market share. That absolutely leads to strong competition, little pricing power, and if you remember some of your micro econ, these are all price takers. Industry capacity. What we mean by capacity is their potential to produce. So undercapacity in general means that all your inputs are all working, you're at maximum capacity. So undercapacity means that the demand exceeds supply, you're not producing enough for the market, What does that mean? Pricing power, because anytime you have excess demand, you can charge a higher price. Then you have potentially overcapacity. Overcapacity is excess capacity. You have a lot of slack resources. That also means that you don't have strong pricing competition, little pricing power, especially when the barriers are high. Going back to the idea of firms that are machine-based, they have to it's really difficult to change their capacity in the short run, which leads to us the idea that capacity is fixed in the short run. Absolutely, you've planned for a certain number of units, difficult to change that, but you can do that in the long run, because if you see what's happening, you could plan better in the long run and change your capacity. But the other thing that could potentially happen is that producers may overshoot future required capacity, especially in cyclical markets. Here's what's happening. Let's say currently you guys are on, the whole industry is under capacity. Everybody says, hey, wait a minute, we could produce more and make more money. Good thing, right? So they all produce and they all overshoot their capacity. Not only that, but the cycle could turn, and now you're in a contractionary part of the market, and you've been hit by both the overshooting the future capacity, and if everybody did that, you're going to have a huge overcapacity, plus the cycle works against you. Other things to look at in terms of industry capacity related to pricing power and return on capital, non-physical capacity, things like human labor skills and human resources, as well as labor mobility. A lot of these things are more easier to reallocate than plant, property, and equipment, big physical capacity things. So it's really difficult to change those than the other factors of production. If capacity is physical and specialized, it's more likely to lead to overcapacity. Then the last of the four, you got the market share stability. What we like, if you're in a highly variable market share, it suggests a lot of competition. What does that mean? Low profitability, low pricing power. All else being equal, if you're in the industry, you want to see stable market share, because then that means you have less competition, you have pricing power. One of the last points here, the last point here is the switching cost contributes to market share stability. In the old days, the best way to think about it is, let's say you either have a PC or a Apple machine, and you buy this hardware, and there used to be very little software that could be used on both machines. So it's a switching cost. If you're going to switch from an Apple machine to a PC, not only are you not going to be able to take all your software, you're going to have to buy all new software. That may mean that you may want to keep the Apple computer because the switching costs are so high. That keeps some stability in the market share. Now we're coming back to the industry life cycle. So I'm going to draw this up on the previous slide, so give me a chance to put this together. And so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to wipe out a lot of this wording, verbiage, boom, and I'm going to draw this up. I keep saying drawing this up. I'm going to draw this. Draw this up is kind of redundant. So it looks like this. I'm going to draw the curve first, and not a bad one actually. And then I'm going to draw the y-axis. That's supposed to be a straight line. This is the x-axis. X-axis is time. Y-axis is demand. And I'm going to start to allocate different phases. And there's 5 phases. And we'll talk about this in depth in a second. The first stage is embryonic. Then you have the growth phase, shakeout, maturity, and decline. And we'll go through each one of them and the way I drew it up. So we'll go through in order. And the first phase is embryonic. What do you have? You have slow growth. You have high prices because nobody's really, it's going to take you, in terms of the efficiency curve, it's going to take you, for cost per output, it's going to be very high. You're going to have large investment required. There's very high risk of failure because mostly the idea there's very little market share. There's very little demand, as you notice at the first stage. Then you have the next stage is the growth phase, the second stage. And once again, in the embryonic stage, if you one of the things that could happen in the embryonic stage, you could start here and go wah. You could just so if you get to the growth phase, that means your industry is matured somewhat. It's getting to a little better point, and the things in the growth phase include demand is growing. Obviously, it's kind of slow. In fact, if you look at the slope, the growth stage is the highest slope. So relative demand per time is growing really quickly. You still have very little competition, but competition is increasing. Prices are somewhat falling on a per unit basis, and you have profitability. The profitability is increasing. So that leads us to the third stage, and the third stage is the shakeout. The shakeout stage, what's happening here? You have slower growth, very intense competition. It's called shakeout because what's going to happen is there's going to be some consolidation within the industry. You have increasing overcapacity, you have declining profitability. So some of the bigger firms, or even some of the smaller firms, will take out some of the competitors. There's going to be potentially some increase in failure. And once the shakeout happens, it'll lead to the mature stage. Here, you're going to have slow growth. You're going to have very few industry competitors left because it's going to be high barrier to entry. You're going to have to compete on things like brand loyalty and cost structure. It's really a difficult time, very little. And the maturity stage is where you have the most stability of growth. And if you get through the maturity stage, you end up in the decline stage. And potentially in the decline stage, what's happening is your product may be obsolete. That's your typewriter. Or, typewriter is probably a good example. Or the newspaper business in terms of your actual newspaper. You may have an online presence, but you may have to shift toward that. So you have negative growth. You have huge excess capacity. You're going to have to compete on price. You have high production cost, and you're going to have a lot of the weak companies are going to they're going to be forced to exit because of the low profitability. So, I'm going to go back to our model, these 5 different phases, and the other thing you need to do is to marry these into the equity valuation ideas, especially when we're talking about the mature stage. In the mature stage, and especially if there's a stable mature stage, you're going to be able to use like single stage growth models, the Gordon growth model, anything to do with single stage models you can apply as long as you're in the mature stage and there's stability. And then you have, and you're more likely, if you're in the growth stage or the shakeout stage, well, especially in the growth stage, you're going to be very likely that you're going to use either a 2-stage model or even a 3-stage model to value your companies. So that leads us to the next slide, industry life cycle. One of the 3 big things in this particular reading is the limitation of the life cycle analysis. It's most useful during stable periods. If you notice, if you looked at the model, the x-axis just says time. What does that mean? There was no real number of periods or years specifically. That's because this model could be really wide or even short depending upon your industry. And in fact, some stages may be skipped altogether. You could go from, say, the growth stage all the way to the maturity stage without any shakeout. Or you could go from the embryonic stage to declining stage rapidly and just even skip the 3 middle stages. And with anything, if you look at the industry life cycle, what does that mean? Industries are made up of companies. So these companies, relatively speaking, the industry is a weighted average of the companies. So some companies are going to do much better than other companies. So you could be in a mature stage and have especially if you're a low-cost producer and you can effectively brand your products, you may be doing really well, even though your industries in the mature stage, you may still be growing potentially. Now we get to the last 2 ideas, and these are the elements of strategic industry analysis. Once again, a laundry list. We're looking at it purely from the industry analysis. This is a checklist of things you need to look for. The first thing we're going to talk about is major firms. Why is that important? Well, a lot of times you're going to look at market size, and the bigger firms are going to be able to dictate a lot of pricing strategies to the smaller firms. So you have to know who the major players are. We talked about the barriers to entry and the ability to succeed, and in terms of industry competitiveness, we talked about that already. We specifically talked about industry concentration. I don't want to repeat a lot of this. Similar ideas apply here. Then you have influences of industry capacity on pricing, all else being equal. Under capacity means more pricing power, over capacity, less pricing power. Industry stability, all else being equal, you want a more stable environment, especially if you're within that industry currently. Life cycle, we talked about the different 5 different stages. You have to identify what stage you're in. The competitive environment, what are we going to use? Porter. Then we're going to look at these 5 external stages, and I guess I'll talk about it here because it gets repeated again, but let's look at some of the different influences. These are external. First one is demographic. So let's say that in Japan, the median age of that population is relatively high. Therefore, they're having some labor issues, and that leads for, and these, by the way, a lot of these influences will overlap each other and will force you to do other things. Because of the age of their population, they're forced into looking at robots during a lot of the labor. Government influences, specifically things like regulatory environment and trade restrictions, are some of the government influences that affect your industry. Social influences, I'm going to give you an example of both social and technological, kind of put them together even though they're separate influences. I'm going to go back to my iPad example. I also making a case for that, the social influence, because Apple was smart enough to create a whole new segment of something between a phone and a PC. I would have thought it would succeed. So socially, this became an acceptable segment, as well as the technological influence of this product filling in a gap. Then, whether the industry is growth, defensive, or cyclical, what does that mean? We're talking about the cyclical part of the industry in terms of whether it's sensitive or less sensitive or non-sensitive to the business cycle. And we sort of talked about these external influences. I think I've sort of talked about the technology, demographic, social influences, and government, but the macroeconomic factors, they absolutely will influence an industry. For example, interest rates are very sensitive to financial services, especially the housing market, credit availability, and interest rates. Inflation affect all industries in terms of real returns. And then you have, one step below the industry analysis, the elements of the company analysis. So you have firm overview, very similar to major firms, industry characteristics, you've got to understand your industry. You've got product demand, you would love to see, all else being equal, you want to see high product demand in your industry, for your company. Also relative to your industry, you want to do better than your peers. Your product cost. As a company, can you be more efficient with your cost structure? The pricing environment, well, how much pricing power do you have as a company? Are you one of the major firms? Financial ratios, whole slew of them from financial reporting and analysis. Remember, go back to ratios. You'd like to see ratios and specific trends relative to both time and within your peer group. You want to see trends positively, especially in terms of profitability, things like liquidity, solvency. All these ratio groups are important. It's a way for us to analyze fundamentally what's going on with the company by looking at the ratios. Then we're going to project financial statements and firm valuations. What do? We've done all the analysis. Now we're going to project our financial statements so that we can evaluate a company. And going back to the idea when you're doing equity valuation, what are you going to look at? You're going to look at what is intrinsic versus what's the market. And then leads us to, this is still part of the Porter model, the elements of company analysis. What is your competitive strategy, really? I mean, in general, you have two general ways to look at your competitive strategy. One is looking at it as a cost leadership. You're the lowest cost producer. If you are the lowest cost producer, you have a huge potential advantage in that you can even do some predatory pricing. You could undercut your prices and still make a profit and push out some of your competitors. And that can happen if you have cost leadership, and it tends to be more and you tend to also compete on cost if you're more commodity-like, less product differentiation, as opposed to the other strategy, product or service differentiation. Here, you're competing on your ability to do something different than your competitors. Things like quality, delivery, achieve a premium price. A good example is, say, Coke and Pepsi. These two companies have a lot of pricing power, and really, if you really look at the actual product itself, is the recipe or the ingredients are just sugar, carbonated water, and syrup. Granted in different quantities, but really, it's just a carbonated beverage, the whole idea of cola. But how do they compete, and why do they have a lot of price power? They differentiate. So if you like Coke, they advertise multi-billion dollars to achieve some kind of identity away from Pepsi, and they're constantly competing against each other. And that kind of finishes this last point in the reading. Let me sum up some of the important items. Make sure you understand Porter. I cannot stress enough. Porter, and Porter. Porter is very important. The competitive environment, as well as I would make sure you understand the elements of both industry analysis, company analysis, as well as the life cycle. So that's this reading. Make sure you understand the major points, and good luck. Thanks.